May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. Friday, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the ordination of the first women priests in the Episcopal Church. The women who were ordained on July 29, 1974 in Philadelphia at the Church of the Advocate chose that day because in 1974, July 29th was the feast day of St. Mary and St. Martha. And they chose that day for their ordination to honor Mary and Martha's vital roles of ministry alongside Jesus. Churches all over the country have been commemorating this event, many by screening the new documentary, The Philadelphia 11. The Philadelphia 11 feature the 11 women who challenged the very essence of patriarchy within Christendom and succeeded in building a movement that transformed an age-old institution, as the promotional materials say. It's a story that needs to be told over and over because it's easy to forget at any point in our history how much we've grown and changed. And we think that the way things are around us, we fall into a lull of thinking that's the way they've always been. Women represent over 40% of active ordained priests in the Episcopal Church. And I was actually stunned to hear that the statistic was that low. I mean, think of our context, think of the people you know, and just hear Mother Anita, Mary Johnstone, Jennifer Pedrick, Liz Haggerty, Jackie Kirby, Ann Bowles-Bevan, Megan Kelly Brower, Stephanie Shoemaker, Virginia Buckles, Maggie Dawn, Susan Barnes, Susan Lukens, and I know you can think of many, many more. And then there's me. I told you before that I told my mother when I was 7 years old that I wanted to be a Jesuit priest. Now, obviously that was a non-starter then and now. And priesthood in the Episcopal Church would not have been available at that time either, although God had been on the move in the church for several years then at that time to restore the historical ministry of our mothers in the faith. Sarah, Rachel, Rebecca, Miriam, Rahab, Esther, Judith, Mother Mary, Mary Magdalene, the Syrophoenician woman, the woman at the well, Lydia, the seller of purple cloth, Prisca, Chloe, Claudia, and countless others, both named and unnamed. I had a different vantage point of God's movement in women's ordination than the one that played out on the evening news and on the front page above the fold in the papers. It was a big deal. That played out alongside the war in Vietnam and the protests and the civil rights marches and all of the difficulties concerning the Watergate investigation and President Nixon's resignation. I had this different perspective because my great-uncle, Robert L. DeWitt, was then the Bishop of Pennsylvania. He was elected in 1962 when race riots were erupting in Chester, Pennsylvania, and I was too young really at that point to follow the news on my own, but I remember the discussions at the dinner table, and I can't tell you that the first words out of my mother's and my grandmother's mouths is, "Oh, we are so happy for Bob's commitment to social justice." I mean, when he rode in the middle of the night with the dean of Penn's law school to Harrisburg to plead with the governor to intervene and bring peace in the race riots, it was scary. And they were concerned about what he was doing. He had evolved into a socially liberal activist known for his outspoken advocacy, campaigning for women's rights and against social inequity, racism, and the war. I really can't say that they were all that approving, my family. I mean, they said they were concerned about my Aunt Bobby and the kids and my uncle, because all of this came about as he was just retired as Bishop of Pennsylvania. He had gone to be the editor of the Witness magazine. And he joined with two other bishops, Edward Wells of Missouri and Daniel Corrigan, who's a former national officer of the church, to break nearly 2,000 years of tradition in ordaining 11 women to the priesthood. The fallout was immediate. Credible threats of violence against the bishops and the ordained women, an emergency meeting of the House of Bishops, charges filed against the three ordaining bishops, and many attempts to keep the women from exercising their ministry. Ultimately, the three bishops were censured by the House of Bishops, and the 1976 General Convention ruled the women's ordinations valid but irregular, which was a far cry from invalid, right, or unlawful. And there was a habit. I've pored over the floor debates in the House of Bishops. It's really interesting reading if you like that kind of thing. But the concern was just getting them off the idea that it was illegal, not legal, because there was foundation for it. It was tradition that was different. So why does this matter today? Why are we talking about this? I mean, especially because, there's so many women in active ministry. What's at stake in this story is a bird's eye view. This is contemporary gospel, right? This is a bird's eye view of God's own activity in the world, in our time, among us. Because we can get stuck and forget that our God is a living God, moving among us every day, just as it seems like business as usual, that I'm standing here in this pulpit, and in a minute we'll celebrate together the Eucharist. We can forget and get stuck and forget to let God move freely among us, shaping and changing us for our time. See, this is what happened when King David, in this morning's reading from 2 Samuel, the Israelites have been carrying the Lord's presence around for centuries, right? And when they stopped for the night, they placed the Ark of the Covenant in the tent or tabernacle known as the tent of meeting. And that's the portable earthly dwelling place for God. In today's story, the Lord has given David rest from his enemies. So David settles in and builds himself a cedar house. He's so comfortable in his new house that he decides to build the Lord a cedar house. But God's having none of it. God is active and on the move among the people. And see, that's what that detail of a cedar house is supposed to do. It's supposed to make us stop, make us pause, make us notice in that specific reference that David is trying to build the home of his own dreams for God. Through Nathan the prophet, the Lord asks King David, when in all the time that God has moved among the people of Israel, did the Lord ever ask David for a cedar house? The Lord will make you a house, Nathan says, or as author Kathleen Norris clarifies, it is not we who must build God a tabernacle, but God who chooses to dwell in and among us. It is in people and not things, that God wishes to live. So how do we make sure that this beautiful building that God has given us for our ministry, our spiritual home here at Emmanuel, where our very name Emmanuel means God with us, moving among us, how can we make sure that this is a tent or a tabernacle and not some early 20th century version of a cedar house? How do we let God make us a house where God can move freely among us? We share our home, building a vibrant and loving community. We build a place that welcomes all people from all places and all seasons. We listen to each other, staying curious and always ready to learn something new or change our minds. We open our doors even wider to the whole community with the community bridge, the construction on which will start in the next week or so because God has moved among us to make available the funds to start construction now. We celebrate and share this glorious building, remembering that it is a holy tabernacle for God in all times, not the comfortable cedar house of our time. And so this is our gospel message today. This is our gospel message. As preacher Nadia Bolz-Weber writes about our gospel today from Mark, the people beg Jesus to let them touch the hem of his cloak. See, that's another particular reference, like David's cedar house, right? It's to cause us to remember that we met the hemorrhaging woman just 2 or 3 Sundays ago. The folks follow Jesus to be made well in today's story because they've heard this woman preach. They've heard this woman tell the story, the good news of what God has done for her. All she had to do was reach out her hand to connect to the living God moving among us, doing marvelous things. Amen.